Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. For 3 days, we've been subjected to deeply disturbing scenes from Haryana as Rampal and his supporters battled with the police whilst the Godman tried desperately to evade arrest. But Rampal is not the first Godman to defy the law and believe he's above it. There's no dearth of others who've attempted the same and indeed got away with it. It's an undeniable fact that in India, Godmen are treated as special and virtually do what they want. So tonight in a special show, we ask, why are Godmen allowed to this special status as if the law does not apply to them? And how can we ensure that they are treated like everyone else? These are questions that go to the very heart of our politics, our character, and very possibly our faith. Over the next 1 hour, I shall try and establish why Godmen hold us in such thrall and why we condone their worst lapses. Joining me now for this special discussion is the head of the Centre for Public Affairs and Critical Theory at Shiv Nazar University, Dipankar Gupta, former Police Commissioner of Delhi and Governor of Jharkhand, Ved Marwa, the author of The God Market, Meera Nanda, the well-known Times of India columnist and commentator, Santosh Desai, the religious affairs commentator and columnist for the Hindustan Times, Renuka Narayan, and author and social activist, Rahul Ishwar. Dipankar Gupta, the list of Godmen who've defied the law and got away with it for long periods is actually a very long one. It includes Rampal, Asaram Bapu, Gurmeet Ram Rahim Singh, Swami Nityanand, Swami Premanand, and if you go back earlier in time, it includes Chandra Swami and people like Dharendra Brahmachari. To what extent do these people get away with defying the law and behaving as if they are above it because politicians either permit them or, worse still, encourage them?
Well, in our country, we have this patron-client relationship, which is particularly prominent in politics. And the names you mentioned, almost all of them, I think without exception, have politicians as their clients. Why politicians are drawn to Godmen is another question, which we can talk about. But because politicians are drawn to Godmen, and they are their clients, it gives these Godmen enormous powers, and they become patrons-in-chief. And as patrons-in-chief, they're expected to break the law, because if you're a good patron, why should you abide by the law? What's the point of hanging around you? So Godmen, by definition, you might say, are patrons, and by definition they're breakers of the law. And because they do us favors, and especially important people, therefore they get away with almost everything.
You know, I want to build on that point, Mr. Marwa, that you've heard from Dipankar Gupta. Gurmeet Ram Rahim and his Dera Sacha Sauda cult is perhaps a classic example of a Godman who's been used both by the BJP and by Congress to help them win elections. Now, if politicians seek favors, I presume they have to return favors as well. Is that one reason why someone like Gurmeet Ram Rahim defies the law, refuses to attend court? He's got a track record of defiance of the court which is equal to Rampal's. Is it because he can demand favors because he gives favors that he can then assume the special status?
It's a mutually beneficial relationship between the politician and the so-called Godmen, these cult figures. They build their following by allowing them to do things which normally they will not be allowed, and they start their careers by trivial violations. As their clout goes up, the legal violations keep on going up, and in the process they make money, they do all sorts of things, and they distribute patronage. I am aware of the fact that certain Godmen are approached by some police officers at the various levels for their postings and transfers. So you can see how influential these people have become. And these people have become because of this nexus between electoral politics and politicians in general.
And a corollary to what you're saying is that if policemen approach godmen for their postings and transfers, then those policemen can never act against the godman, and the godman knows it.
You see, that's another point. Today, the police is, and this is not only in Haryana, in many parts of the country, they look beyond their shoulder to see what does the politician, the ruling party wants, and act accordingly. Now, this is something which is becoming worse and worse, and today police is no longer a professional force that is expected to implement the rule of law in an impartial manner, irrespective of any consideration whatsoever.
Rahul Ishwar, I want to quote to you from Meerananda, who also happens to be a guest on our show tonight. I'm quoting from her book, The God Market. She writes, "Behind every successful godman in India today stands a cluster of powerful politicos with free access to public assets and the machinery of the state." And then she adds, "A state temple corporate complex is always and everywhere at work in India." Would you accept that the link between godmen, between businessmen and corporate leaders and politicians works in such a way that godmen get elevated to the super status where they can willfully defy the law, knowing that they will be protected and no one will ask questions?
I would definitely concede that there are many black sheeps among Babas. But having said that, we shouldn't paint everyone with the same brush. We should remember, even the great Indian freedom struggle was started by a sannyasi rebellion where fakirs and sons came together to fight. Swami Vivekananda was a spiritual guru, so was Gandhiji, who blended spirituality with politics. Having said that, in the present times, yes, we accept that there are some problems. There are many people who use social political influences in the garb of spirituality. Maybe they are only 1%, but they are bringing bad name to the whole faith or the whole arena of spirituality. But what are the solutions ahead?
We come to solutions later. I'll come to solutions later. I want to first spend a little time analyzing the problem. I promise you I'll come to solutions later. You're saying to me that it's only 1% of the so-called spiritual leaders who behave like the Rampals and Asaram Bapus. The vast majority are genuinely spiritual and genuinely law-abiding. Have I understood that correctly?
Exactly. Only a minuscule percentage is there, because India is a spiritual nation. We have spiritual gurus all around. Many are doing great work, including the Naxal, Maoist areas, in the poor areas, the tribal areas. We shouldn't see them in the shadow of the bad people, and we should not paint everybody with the same brush. And if I can use one line, even thousands of years back, Ravana kidnapped Sita, masking himself as a saint. So even bad Babas or godmen in the wrong dress was always there. So it is about identifying who is right, who is a good man and who is a bad man.
Meerananda, I want to put something to you. The politician-godman link is not simply based on the fact that politicians use godmen or the supporters of godmen for electoral and political purposes. It's also based on the fact that politicians seek favors and seek blessings from godmen as devotees. You often see Indian politicians literally on bended knees in front of these so-called sants. You see them often prostrating themselves. Now, when a politician reduces himself in that manner, behaves in that manner in front of a godman, the message he's clearly sending out is that you are God and I am your servant. And therefore, the servant can't really hold the God to the law. Is that a correct interpretation of that relationship?
Absolutely, yeah.
Why do you think that happens?
That is, in fact, that goes to the heart of the problem. The nexus between politicians and godmen is, of course, political economic at one level. You know, there are land grants and all sorts of favors, and they protect the godmen from legal processes. But it is based upon sometimes genuine faith. I mean, they approach our elected representatives of a secular state, approach these godmen on bended knees, seeking their blessings, doing all sorts of tantric, all kind of rituals with them. And then how can they, if you call somebody a god, you can't defy them. You cannot, send your forces to put them in prison. And there are recorded cases of such behavior. The police inspector Banzara in Gujarat, who was involved in the killings of And he was both a devotee of Asaram, and he called Asaram his guru and Modi his god. How could he go against their wishes? You know, he wasn't going to arrest Asaram.
Right.
So
The
yeah,
very nature
this
of
faith
the-
element in the nexus between politicians and godmen.
You know, it's this business of the nature of the relationship between politicians, whether as politicians or whether as devotees and godmen, that I want to explore a little further with you, Santosh Desai. And once again, to do so, I'm going to quote from Meera Nanda's book. She writes, "When our elected representatives, policymakers, and state functionaries approach the religious establishment as devotees, rather than as officials of a secular state with a constitutional mandate to create a secular public culture, what we get and end up with is a culture seeped in disregard for the law." Would you accept that? That the critical problem is politicians ceasing to be secular politicians and becoming religious devotees, and thus confusing the relationship?
I think there is, there is a lot of truth in that. I
Is
do
it
think
addressed
that
to me?
No, to
because of the
Santosh
fact
Desai.
that, when it comes to,
Carry on.
yeah, so because of the fact that, in a sense, everyone approaches religious leaders as devotees, the lines between what is institutional sort of, institutional lines versus the line of being a devotee gets crossed. And I think in many ways, therefore, you are seeing this phenomenon where the kind of informal power that is being exercised by religious leaders is really what is, blurring the lines between institutional mechanisms and effectiveness and this becoming devotees, and therefore eventually surrendering whatever might come through the institutional mechanism to this act of being simple religious devotees.
We're explaining the situation so far in terms of politicians and their relationship to Godmen, and we're blaming politicians for surrendering themselves, for making themselves subliminal or subordinate. But in a sense, isn't this something that we should accuse ourselves as a nation, as a people of? Because at the end of the day, we as a people believe Godmen are special. As Dipankar Gupta said a moment ago, by definition for us, Godmen are godmen and therefore above us and above the law. Are we not to blame as much as politicians? Is it not our culture and our attitude that politicians reflect?
Absolutely. I mean, this goes back very, very old to a very, very long ago time when, new cults came up and it was all personalized. The Buddha actually was one such, when you think about it. And people are used to laying down their hearts and their lives and their properties behind somebody they follow. And this tradition is, it's in the mental makeup of the people. And I think Meera made a good point.
So you're saying it's in the culture of the Indian people
Totally.
to sublimate themselves and treat Godmen as if they're special, and therefore not care when Godmen break the law. We expect them to do it.
Yeah, or want to exchange bodily fluids, they just don't know where to draw the line. So I think that's a very good point made there, that the secular relationship has to be recast. You have to step back from yourself as an individual practitioner of a particular faith and say, no, as an officer of the law, I have to lead a lonely life in this department.
Let's explore that a little further. I'm talking, Dipankar Gupta, of our attitude as people, as Indians, as individuals to Godmen. First, we readily call anyone wearing saffron, anyone claiming spiritual elevation, a Baba, a Swami, a Sant. We give them that title without even questioning it. Then, whether we're politicians, lawyers, and businessmen at one end of the spectrum, or just farmers and lowly policemen and soldiers at the other, we fold our hands and bend before so-called Godmen. We seek their blessings. More importantly, we believe we benefit by doing service to them. If that's our attitude, we're making them special, even if they don't want to be. We're actually forcing them onto a pedestal and saying, rise above us.
Well, that's one thing. To respect a person wearing saffron or with matted locks, that's one thing. What is being discussed here is when those people begin to break the law and yet win so many adherents. That is the puzzling part. Because in all religions, I think there is a certain respect people show to religious virtuosos. and we should keep that aside. But in this case, it is surprising that when a religious leader, quote unquote religious leader, breaks the law, he in fact gains more supporters. And that's the point I want to make, that in our country over the years we have actually developed this patron-client relationship so vastly and so profoundly that it's difficult to come out of it.
Are you suggesting there's a certain shabashi element? When a godman breaks the law, he's proving he's a super godman, he's proving he's God.
Well, as you said, the politician says, you're a god and I'm your man. But the fact is, over here, which we should emphasize, is that in these relationships, a godman is somebody who is really above the law, and because the godman is above the law, the godman is so powerful.
You know, I want to explore this thing about the attitude of individuals, our cultural attitude to godmen. Do we cross over from reverence and perhaps worship, which is legitimate, to obsequiousness and treatment of a man who you consider a saint metaphorically into someone who becomes actually a physical living God? Do we cross that critical line from reverence to obsequiousness without even realizing it?
A distinction must be made between genuine spiritual leaders, one can agree or disagree with them, and these so-called charlatans who are really criminals in disguise, and they exploit the gullibility of the trusting people, and it's in our country where there is such a large illiterate population, then this is easier than in other countries. There is a certain amount of hypocrisy here also. Our political leaders give themselves an image of religiosity by bowing before these religious gurus, because I recall.
But let me stop you there. If it's a sham that they're doing to give themselves the image of religiosity, the problem is it still deters them from actually taking action against that godman. The sham becomes in fact a hindrance when it's a question of action, because once you've prostrated yourself, how on earth do you stand up and say, and you're going to jail tomorrow?
Not only because they are doing this sham respect for the godmen, they also use and exploit these godmen for their own political and other interests.
Absolutely. But let me put this to you, Santosh, this time. Perhaps this is trying to be a bit more understanding of the social, cultural attitudes we show to godmen, which at the moment we're criticizing. Often, we're a nation that believes in miracles. We live in hope of miracles, and we believe in them when we see them. And maybe this is because of our poverty, maybe this is because of our superstitiousness. But if you believe in miracles, then a so-called godman who delivers a miracle actually becomes someone you automatically fall under the thrall of. Is it therefore our belief in miracles and our hope that miracles will happen because of our poverty or our superstition that puts us under the thrall of godmen?
At a universal level, the need to believe in miracles, cuts across cultures. But I think in India, it's true that because of circumstances and the fact that you want to find a miraculous way around circumstances, and therefore the idea of godmen becomes that much more attractive. The process of believing, the fact is that godmen do not derive their power from any other institutional authority. It is purely the power that is derived by the people who believe in them. Now in India, as it turns out, the meaning of power seems to me the ability to break rules. So therefore, the moment that power gets invested in this figure, and particularly a figure which has a hotline to divinity, then the notion that one is above the law, that becomes applied. That is true for politicians, is true for everybody who is seen to have any kind of power, that the meaning of power is that you have the ability to break rules that mortals must follow. And I think that is the dynamic that is at play here. Need to believe in miracles, investing somebody with power, that automatically becomes illegitimate.
I want to take that point, Mirananda, one step further. We're trying to understand why Indian people so readily put themselves under the thrall of godmen. Let me put this to you. A lot of people who go to godmen come from disadvantaged, poor backgrounds. They're often ill, they're often in need of help. In their world, which is hard and difficult and unrelenting, the godman is often their only salvation. Is that another reason why they so automatically put these godmen on a pedestal and accept whatever they do, whether it's in the law or outside the law. Because from their poverty and their disadvantage, they can't challenge the source of salvation that they found.
Well, I think it's too simplistic to I'm not saying you are being simplistic, but generally this equation that's made between poverty and the need for some sort of opium in life, it doesn't really seem to hold, because there are more fancy godmen. This particular
kind of follow, it looks like it's small town.
Oh, we
But,
seem to
you
have
know,
lost
there are
the line
government-
to Meera Nanda at that critical point. What she was suggesting is that that theory that I was putting as an explanation of understanding is a little bit too simplistic, but unfortunately the rest of that answer we've lost. Let me put an example of that to you, Rahul Ishwar. For instance, today's Indian Express reports that Rampal's devotees would treat as prasad kheer made out of the milk he had bathed in. You and I would probably have a heart attack if we were asked to eat that kheer. They treated it prasad. More importantly, they believed that that kheer worked miracles. Is there not something in that attitude that automatically assumes that whatever Rampal does is miraculous, Rampal is God?
And let me concede very openly that the majority community's faith in India is not at all codified, institutionalized, and there are no systems and structures. We don't even have enough checks and balances. This is an open point. When all our meetings or all our gatherings happen, we do consider and we discuss these points. Anybody who can buy a saffron garb or a white garb with 100 rupees can proclaim himself to be as Baba, as son. I have personally met 3 people who claim.
Oh no, we're losing another line.
Even Rampal, many people say, was claiming to be the reincarnation of Kabir. So this is an issue we have. This is an honest issue we have. This is a space where true spiritualists or rational spiritualists will join hands with media in exposing and creating a filter where we can weed out these negative elements. We can create a sort of filter, a check and balance, where we can legitimately understand who is a real spiritual guy or who is a person who can inspire philosophy in you and who is a charlatan. And the number of charlatans are increasing, and that is a point with great pain. I would like to say, of course, we understand as people who is in this area, we understand there are a lot of people who are misguiding, who are utilizing the gullibility of uneducated youth for these things. So that's a very realistic problem, and we have to seriously brainstorm on solutions along with the government, court, judiciary, and media should brainstorm on these.
You know, there's a very interesting point Rahul Ishwar is raising. He's trying to explain why it is that we as people fall under the influence of charlatans so easily and so quickly. You believe that our popular belief in miracles and magic, which leads us into this thraldom under charlatans quite often, is directly linked to the very nature and character of Hinduism, and it's to do with the nature of relationship in Hinduism that believers have with their gods. Explain that for people who don't readily know and understand this.
Well, there's something which is not a very popular thing to say, but the fact of the matter is that if you look at Hinduism, from the Rig Veda, from the Vedic time onwards, you'll find that most of the hymns and verses are to gods asking them for favors, saying that, you know, we are going to give you all this libation, soma, we are willing to praise you effusively, and in return of that praise, could you give us children, sons, particularly land, and wealth beyond belief, and fame too. Some of the gods are supposed to be people who have powers that can crush fortresses, very mundane things, you know, that ordinary people would want. But to get those things, they pray to God for favors, and that is the most essential part. Later on, there's been a break, as we know, with the Upanishadic period. There's a break, but it's not as if the break is complete. Even the Upanishadic period, the Brihadanaki Upanishad, you'll find Chandra Yuga also, elements of this. But in the Manduk Upanishad, the thing is very, very interesting. It says there's high knowledge and low knowledge. And low knowledge in the Manduk Upanishads is the knowledge derived from the Vedas. And high knowledge is the knowledge of the Brahmas.
So what you're suggesting is that in the sort of Upanishadic or Vedic faiths that you're describing,
Upanishadic is not exactly Vedic, it's a later
I was saying
faith.
about the nature of the relationship between the worshipper and God is a client-customer relationship.
Yes.
And we are constantly beseeching, or as Pavan Verma in one of his books says, bribing our gods to do things and favors for us.
Yes.
Why does that lead us to putting ourselves in the thrall of godmen, particularly charlatans?
Well, I think, as you know, this it was also mentioned here, I think Santosh mentioned it, and quite correctly, that it is not as if it's a typically Indian problem that we look for miracles. Everywhere that people look for miracles. In India, it is probably exaggerated by the fact that a religion allows this kind of miracle seekers more credibility, simply because their texts support and encourage this point of view.
You had another point that you were mentioning when I spoke to you. You said that distinction can be drawn between Islam and Christianity, where God is approached through communion in congregation, and Hinduism, where God can be approached either directly or through intermediaries, and that intermediary can often be an Asaram Bapu or a Rampal, whether he's a genuine one or a charlatan.
Or even a Bhindranwale. Yes, you're right, because the Hinduism is not like other religions. Regardless of the fact we don't have a book, etc., etc., those are all minor points. The major point in Hinduism is there's nothing that two Hindus can do which one Hindu cannot. Whereas Hinduism, you don't need a communion. In every other major religion, at least, it is when you're in communion that you're really in a spiritual atmosphere.
And this puts us under the thrall of God.
Exactly. So therefore we have a one-to-one relationship with God and Godmen, and we expect magic. So there's a magician and client. They're not Godmen really. They're magicians and clients who promise all kinds of things. For example, the Ponzi scheme is everywhere in the world. But the Ponzi scheme works rather nicely in India because there's so many people who are willing to believe that this particular Godman can deliver miracles for us.
He's suggesting something very interesting, Renuka Narayanan. He's suggesting, A, that the very character and nature of the Hindu faith, and secondly, the nature of the relationship in that faith between the worshipper and God is such that there's a gullibility, but also a bribeability on the part of the worshipper. And as a result, intermediaries play the role of pretending to be godlike creatures, and we fall under their thrall, which makes us, he says, very different to Islam and Christianity. How far do you agree with him?
Even Sikhism.
Even Sikhism. How far do you agree with him?
Well, I agree on a couple of things and disagree on a couple of things. Our gullibility is a fact, but I'd say we share it with everybody who believes that miracles happened in their faith, and this is across faiths. They have their share of magic if they believe that God made the world in 6 days, if the Red Sea parted, if animals spoke, supernatural beings came and went. The long tradition of Catholic saints and their miracles. And Islam is about submission, and Pirs and Sufis also have miracles attributed to them. And there are Quranic, supernatural events also.
These are all areas where you disagree with the Dipakar Gupta.
No,
where do you agree with him?
Not disagree precisely, but
where
adding.
do you agree with him?
I agree on the point that we are gullible, and nothing that's ever come our way from the days of the Vedas and the Upanishads has told us anything different. Everybody is in the magic, business, in the story of magic. But there is one big thing where I think the door is open for Hinduism to take a rational path out. And that is the Rig Veda, the 10th mandala, the 129th sukta, where they question the very existence of the universe and say, we don't know.
Absolutely, but that's hardly central to what either Godmen preach or what we as worshippers of the Hindu faith follow. It's an element of the sophistication of the intellectual capacity of our religion.
It's there, but it's not being used.
It's not part of our everyday faith. Let me bring you in on